Well, welcome everyone to our webinar today on behalf of WoodSolutions and the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, looking at wood specification and use in external applications, in our webinar 3 today on timber durability and specification. In the spirit of reconciliation, Forest and Wood Products Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We acknowledge their connection to the land and their custodianship of country and forests. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So my name's Alistair Woodard. I'm part of the WoodSolutions technical team. So we're halfway through our series with AILA here, up to webinar 3, with 2 more coming up over the next 2 weeks. So I'd encourage, if you haven't already registered for those, to do so. Very briefly, WoodSolutions is an industry initiative which is resourced through Forest and Wood Products Australia. We're here for you guys, for building professionals. We want to inspire you to use wood, and then if you do so, then provide you with whatever information and resources and education you might need to do that properly. We undertake a range of different events, such as the seminars today, also technical tutorials in-house, sponsor the major organisations. But most importantly, we produce quite a lot of technical information, which is available through our technical design guides on the woodsolutions.com.au website. One in particular I want to just make you aware of you today is our technical design guide number 5, Timber Service Life Design Guide for Durability. And a lot of what Jeff will be covering today is also mentioned in this design guide. So encourage you to download that one from the website. In terms of our events, we do this quite regularly. If you want to find out what events are happening through WoodSolutions, just go to the website and click on the events tab. You can actually get links to the upcoming AILA webinars there if you haven't registered and want to do so. Also, just a reminder that all our webinars are recorded, as these ones are. If you want to access those, go to the WoodSolutions website and click on the webinar tab, and you can download those from there, or let your colleagues know they're available if you found them of interest. So just quickly, in terms of interacting in today's webinar, if you want to chat amongst yourselves, and we encourage you to do that, just use the chat function down below, but use the all panelists and attendees. But more importantly, we are certainly very keen to get any questions that you might have that we'll answer at the end of the webinar today. So use the Q&A tab down the bottom, write your questions in there. If people like those questions, they can click on that, which will prioritise some of those to the top. But definitely keen to get any questions you might have. Also, you can get informal CPD points for attendance at today's webinar. You'll be sent a certificate at the end of the webinar. Should get that within a week, but they generally get them out within the week. Just if you don't see it in your normal mail, have a look in your junk mail, because sometimes it might end up there. Just please store those certificates in a safe place, because we really can't reissue them after they're issued. It really does give me pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Jeff Morrell, who's the Director of the National Centre for Timber Durability and Design Life, which is based at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Jeff received his education in forest biology, pathology and mycology in New York and Pennsylvania. And he initially trained as a forester because he wanted to save trees, but sees his career as having worked to achieve that through extending the service life of timber and thereby reducing the need to harvest additional wood. Jeff began his work life as an engineer's assistant for an electric utility before joining Oregon State University in 1983, where he worked his way up through the academic ranks to become a distinguished university professor. We were very fortunate in 2017 to headhunt Jeff out to Australia, where he was appointed the inaugural director of the National Centre for Timber Durability and Design Life. Jeff's expertise is in the area of wood deterioration and its prevention, where he's undertaken extensive research to identify the fungi associated with the deterioration process, assess the potential for biological control of decay, and develop both methods for improving wood treatments and then systems for arresting decay once it has been initiated. So he's eminently qualified to speak to us today on this critically important topic of timber durability and specification. We're hoping today, in terms of learning outcomes, that you'll get out of this presentation an understanding of the physical nature of wood and why degradation can occur, an understanding from a durability perspective of the main hazards for timber, and an understanding of the key actions in minimising and/or preventing the degradation of wood products. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, Alistair. I appreciate that. I will share my screen. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will join Alistair in acknowledging the Cubby, who are the Aboriginal owners of the land around USC. And I think it's particularly fitting that we acknowledge that, because we are shepherds of the resources, and particularly with timber, it's particularly important for us to do that because it is a precious resource that we want to conserve. So as Alistair said, I'm from the University of the Sunshine Coast, just north of Brisbane. Our center, sorry, I've got an issue. There we go. Our center is based as a partnership of 3 different groups: University of Queensland, Queensland Department of Ag and Fisheries, and the University of the Sunshine Coast. And it is supported by Forest and Wood Products Australia, who see the need for durability research and extending the resource as much as we do. To kind of start the point here, we've used wood for thousands of years. It's an important part of what we are, and we feel very different around it. And it gives us a warm feeling. We want to make sure we use it properly. This temple in Japan is about 800 years old, and it's been maintained. And I think it's particularly important to look at that. But we can look at really old temples, but we can look at relatively newer buildings. This one's about 100 years old. And you see features in here that explain, that tell us that the people who used the wood knew what they were doing. They understood design, they understood the principles of using timber properly, and they also maintained it. So hopefully this morning, this afternoon, I'll give you a little bit of background about the organisms that attack wood, what they do, why they're there, to give some context to the next 2 presentations on treatments and coatings, which are also equally important. And we now use wood in very different ways, but it really hasn't changed that much. And this is just a big timber building, but it has many of the same principles that we would see in any other timber structure. And you'd have to say, well, why do we care about wood? We have a country that's really dry. We don't have that much timber. But reality is that Oceania, which includes us and New Zealand and PNG and a couple other countries, uses the 2nd most wood per capita on the planet. So we use a lot of timber. It's very important to us to use. We import about 35% of our timber, but we have a fairly active forest industry, and it's an important part of who and what we are. As we get into dealing with timber, one of the things everybody sort of knows is, well, wood decays. And when we use wood, we have to understand that. And that process starts right from the start when the tree is live and growing. This particular tree has a heart rod on the right-hand side that has started while the tree was alive. It would actually stop once the tree is cut, but other organisms will get in. So we know that. But we also know that everything else degrades too. So concrete will spall and fall apart. Steel will corrode. Metal and wood can get together and corrode all by themselves. And so when we look at materials, we have to understand their lifespan and how to use them properly. And if we do that, then we're good stewards of the material, and it doesn't really matter what it is. Timber sometimes requires some special features, but other materials do too. So let's have a look at the wood and see what we're talking about. So we often call it's a porous cellulosic material. You can imagine the wood is a bundle of straws, because that's really kind of what it is. It's there for conducting water from the roots up into the leaves. There are lots of structure to it. They vary by species. Australia is blessed to have hundreds and actually thousands of species of timber with many different properties, but they all have some basic tenets. And if we looked at it chemically, what's in there? Well, there's polymers. And wood is a biopolymer. It's got hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. Those are all polymers. They all serve different functions in the wood. And then we have these other things that are in there that are extractives, sugars and starches and proteins, and all kinds of other stuff. And what's in there really is energy. If I want to use wood, I have to figure out how to get at that energy. And relatively few organisms have figured out how to do that, but they're enough for us to worry about and understand. So look at the wood as a smorgasbord of different chemicals that fungi, insects, and other things can get at. So decay, as I said, can start in a living tree, but it can continue on. We have different types of degradation that we look at. The first one is abiotic, and abiotic means that there's nothing living going on.
So if we look at things like sunlight, fire, strong acids and bases, mechanical wear, those are all things that don't have biology involved. They're just physical or chemical reactions. And the one we know most about or concerned about in a lot of places is timber burns. We all know wood burns. It's a lovely warm feeling to use timber. And so we look at that, but we can design around that, or we can use chemical retardants. But it's also necessary to understand that timber behaves pretty well on a fire. This is an example of a cross-laminated timber piece that was subjected to a fire test. And you can see that the outside charred. The center of it is perfectly sound because the char formed a layer that protected the wood from fire. So in many cases, a timber building is really safe to be in because it burns at a steady rate and you have time for people to evacuate, and there are ways to mitigate the fire. So we can deal with fire. Physical degradation is another factor that we deal with, and that can be from repeated mechanical wear. The best example are sleepers in railroad tracks because they're subjected to repeated loading. And most times sleepers will wear out not from biological damage, but from physical damage. So that's another example. The other one that's probably way more important in a landscape exposure place would be UV. So ultraviolet light carries energy. When it strikes the wood, it releases that energy and it forms what are called free radicals. And we're all told when we're eating food that we don't want to have free radicals because they're bad for us. They're bad for wood too. They tend to break the wood down, but they don't go very deeply into the wood. And if you see this piece of cedar, you can see that the surface is very gray. The interior is quite white because the light couldn't penetrate. So generally light woods tend to darken and dark woods tend to lighten, but it's a very slow process. You might look at millimeters in a century, not really fast. And it's very analogous to what we do with slip, slap, sleek, or whatever it is now, but it's the same thing. Our skin is sensitive to UV, so is timber. So we need to use UV protection where we expose it to sunlight. And that's an important part of maintaining the appearance and extending the life of timber. But the bigger part of where we lose timber is in biological degradation. And all the organisms that degrade wood have 4 basic requirements. They need to have an adequate temperature, which is usually somewhere above 5 and upwards of 40 degrees Celsius. They need to have oxygen, but they don't need very much of it. Many of them can live at very low oxygen levels. They need water, which is necessary for biological activity. And the final thing they need is food. So when we look at how we deal with organisms and how we prevent them, we take advantage of those requirements. We can't control temperature very much because obviously the building is whatever temperature it's going to be and it's in a wide range. We can, however, sometimes control oxygen, which we'll talk about because we can limit oxygen if we immerse the wood in water. But realistically, what we do mostly in design is we either exclude water, so we have the wood too dry for organisms to grow, or we alter the food source. And those are the 2 methods of extending or making sure wood lasts a long time. So water is really the enemy of all materials. It isn't just timber, it's steel and concrete. So looking at water intrusion is really important. Water and wood is important to understand, because wood is really kind of a unique material. We talk about it in our education classes about it being lignocellulosic, which means it's a polymer. It's anisotropic, which means it has different properties in different directions. But the most important one from a design feature is that it's hygroscopic. It will tend to absorb water from the air. It will tend to absorb water from solutions. And so we have to understand water and what it does. And in water, we have 2 different types of water, although both of them are wet. But within the cell wall, the first part of the water that is coming into the wood will be bound to the cell wall chemistry. And we call that bound water because it is interacting with the cellulose and it's actually causing the wood to swell a little bit. And then once you get to a certain point, that water is free water. Bound water, very few organisms can attack wood that only has bound water in it. So if you keep the wood dry enough to not have free water, it will remain free from most organismal attacks. So fungi, a lot of insects. So we talk about free water and bound water. And as I said, the bound water effects are things like as water is absorbed by the cell wall, it swells. So we know that doors sometimes stick when it's really humid. That's an example of why. Bound water changes the thermal conductivity. And actually, when you design, we look at reduced strength as the wood gets wet.
up until a certain point. So when we design with timber, we know that we either have dry use or wet use. And our properties are different for those two applications because we know the strength changes. The point we look at for that magical flex point is called the fiber saturation point. And that's the point where there's no free water present, but the cell walls have the maximum amount of bound water in the wood. So that's a point we always look to stay below when we're trying to work with timber where we can control that. In terms of where water comes from in the wood, well, obviously the sky when it rains, but if you look at air, the wood is going to absorb moisture at different relative humidities. So at the moister the air, the wetter the wood will be up until about 20 or 23% moisture content. So well below the fiber saturation point, it will absorb water. And if you're in say cans, your moisture contents are likely to be slightly higher than they'll be if you're in say Alice Springs, because there's less moisture in the air. We also get rain during construction, which is really important to consider for avoiding moisture. Leaks in service, condensation from poor mechanicals, and flooding, which we'll talk about at the end, are all sources of moisture, most of which can be controlled or at least addressed afterwards. And this just gives you an idea about what moisture contents wood will be at different relative humidities and temperatures. And if you look at the chart, you'll see that on the far right-hand column, at 90% relative humidity, which is Brisbane in the midsummer sometimes, even when you get really hot, like 32 Celsius, the moisture content of the wood should not go above 20 or 22%. So in general, wood will stay within the protective range if there's no external sources of moisture, and that's important to avoid. So the free water effects, as I said, once you get water in the wood, thermal conductivity changes, it becomes more conducive, more conductive. Electrical resistance changes, the mass obviously changes because it's wetter. When we talk about treating wood, high moisture contents will limit the amount of preservative we can get in the wood, so that makes it less treatable. But the one we're going to talk about mostly today is durability, the susceptibility of the wood to fungal and insect attack increases as the wood is wetted. So those are important things to avoid if you can. If not, then you have to change the wood resource itself. So water plays a lot of roles in wood. For one thing, it swells, as we talked about. So up to the fiber saturation, the wood will swell. It is really important to have free water for the fungus because the fungus can't reach out and bite the wood and tear off bits of it and chew it out. It has to have moisture for the enzymes that it produces to diffuse into the wood and the breakdown products to diffuse back. So if that's not present, that doesn't happen. Water is also a reactant. So it's part of what we call hydrolysis and breaking down the cellulose and hemicellulose. So it's part of the reactions. If you get a lot of water, it excludes oxygen. So we'll talk about that in a second. It obviously supports fungal growth. It can also attract termites. If you have a lot of water in the building, that will tend to get more termites to move upward into the structure. We do use water in a positive way. This is an example of a log pond, and this is an example of a sprinkler deck of logs that are freshly cut. And the concept here is to keep the wood so wet that there's no place for oxygen to be. And we do that in mills a lot to keep logs fresh. We do it also to keep them from checking and splitting, but it does keep insects and fungal attack down. So we look at those control mechanisms of controlling water, using water and food as our opportunities. There are two different extremes here. If you have too little water, then there's no decay because there's no water for diffusion to occur. If you have too much, the same thing happens. And the good examples of that, one would be the outback of Australia where there's very little moisture. The other alternative of too much would be places like Venice, where the buildings are built on untreated timber piling that have been submerged, and they are 400 to 500 years old, and they are generally pretty sound because there's no oxygen present. And so the decay, which will occur, is very, very slow. So we can use water to our advantage or disadvantage. In terms of what we worry about, we won't talk about bacteria, although they're always present, but they tend to be less of a concern. But we worry about fungi, insects, and I'll mention marine borers briefly because you may be putting some coastal projects in. So beetles are probably not as important in products, but they become more important in the freshly felled trees. So many beetles will attack freshly killed trees or dying trees, lay their eggs in the wood. The larvae will hatch, go through their life cycle in the wood, and they either tunnel through and damage the wood, or they carry with them stain or decay fungi that also damage the wood. Once the wood is older, the beetles really can't attack that much, so they're less of a problem. One of the ones we see very commonly in freshly sawn timber are ambrosia beetles, which are, ambrosia means food of the gods. So these beetles tunnel in to the wood. They don't use wood for food. They tunnel in and they plant a fungus in the wood that grows into the wood and uses the wood. And then the beetle larvae feed on the fungus, and the fungus stains the wood. They're not a structural issue, but you may occasionally see tunnels on the surface of the wood. They really don't cause much damage. They're very small. We also have other wood borers that are a little more robust. Longicorn or longhorn beetles and metallic wood borers are two of the really prettier ones. They lay eggs on dying trees. The larvae, or the eggs hatch, the larvae tunnel in. They tunnel in the wood for 1 to 2 years, and they emerge to find a new tree. So once they're in the wood, it can be very hard to detect them because they start off very small and they grow bigger. We don't have as much trouble with these in most of our timber, particularly structural, because we kiln dry our timber. So we kill the beetles if they're present in the wood. But you would have expected after the bushfires a couple of years ago to see a lot more beetles in some of the timber and maybe see some of the beetle holes, beetle galleries that you'd see. But generally, we don't have as much trouble with these types of beetles in structures because of the use of kiln drying to kill the timber before you reuse it. Generally, the other way to get rid of these, to keep these beetles out when you have the bark on the tree, is to take the bark out of the tree, because if you take the bark off, these beetles really can't invade the wood. So no bark. Okay, the one group you do worry about in structures are powder post beetles. Powder post beetles can attack fairly dry wood below the fiber saturation point, so below 20%. They lay their eggs on the surface, they tunnel in. You don't really see any sign of them until they exit the wood. And in this particular case, you can see all that little sawdusty stuff, powdery stuff falling out of the holes. That's a good example of powder post beetles. They only attack sapwood, and they don't attack all sapwoods. They attack woods with more starch. And so if you go to the Australian National Standard AS 5604, you'll see that there are rankings for powder post beetle susceptibility or lichted susceptibility within that tell you what woods need protection and what woods don't. Coatings and finishes limit attack. So that's an easy way to do it if you're using finished wood. They can become problematic in some places. The big thing we worry about, though, are termites. We have really heaps of termites. We have some amazing termites in Australia. In fact, we have the largest termites in the world, and they can cause a lot of damage. These particular termites live underground. They're subterranean. They live in large colonies. In some cases, for some of the subs, 1 to 7 million workers in a colony, and they're always using wood. So they can become very destructive as pests. They're social insects. So there's a king, a queen, workers, soldiers. Colony serves the queen. They feed on cellulose, but not all of them use wood. If you fly into like Townsville and some of the other northern Queensland airports, you'll see mounds along the runway, and those are actually grass-feeding termites. So they don't always use wood, but most of the wood-attacking species, they have protozoa in their gut that help them digest cellulose. They can be very destructive in a very short period of time. As I said, we have subterranean termites, which live in ground contact. We have dampwood termites, not very common here, but they live in very wet wood. And then the other group we have are drywood termites, which live in wood, in structures, very dry wood, and they've evolved basically in places like dead branches up on a tree. But a building, a truss in a building looks pretty much like a branch to a termite. So we do see them showing up in structures. There are lots of ways to try and keep them out. So these are examples of termites. Upper left is a queen, lower right or right-hand side is a soldier. You can see the big mandibles that don't do very much. And then you can see this mass of termites on the left-hand side. Termites are always feeding. The colonies can be very, very large. Termite damage can vary. It tends to, for subterraneans and dampwood termites, it tends to be very dirty. They don't leave the nest, so they leave their frass or their droppings within the nest. They can also make mud tubes, and on the lower right-hand side, you can see where termite has come in on that piece of timber in the middle. There are tubes going out so the termite can explore for other food sources along that masonry wall. So they can cause a lot of damage very quickly. The other cool thing they can do is they make these mud tubes sometimes straight up from the ground on the lower right hand, on the right hand side, you can see where the tube is going up, and that allowed them to go from the dirt all the way up into the timber that is well off the ground and would normally be protected. So they can cause a fair amount of damage, and that's why we recommend termite inspections annually, just to make sure that nothing has changed. They also, some species will build mounds. They do them for protection. Obviously, they don't want to be eaten. They do it for temperature control because they can move up and down within it. Not all species create them, and not all species create them in the same area. For example, one of the termites we deal with, Termites aciformis, only forms mounds north of the Tropic of Capricorn, so around Rockhampton. South of there, you don't have mounds, and so they're much harder to find. The mounds are like rocks; they're very hard to dig into, and they're kind of cool looking. They can get quite large for some of the grass-feeding termites. We have an extreme termite risk in many parts of the country, and this map kind of illustrates that. The red is extremely high. You can see the green is the snowiest because it's too cold, and Tasmania has negligible termite risk, so it really has no economically important termites. But you can see that where most of us live is where most of the termites live, so we always have to be aware that we live in a high-risk termite zone, which is important for design and building. Termites can be prevented by a lot of different ways. One is to limit soil contact, but as you see, that's not always going to be completely effective. We tend to create gaps or barriers. We can treat the wood, or we can poison the soil. Those are kind of our strategies. Barriers are commonly used. If you look at some houses, old Queenslanders, particularly up here, they have ant caps on the stumps on the building. And those aren't just, they aren't going to stop the termite from going around them, but all they do is make the termite attack the tubes more visible so you can detect what's going on. We see physical barriers like Termi mesh, which is stainless steel, mesh, which has holes that are too small for the termite to go through, or granite guard, which are both put in the foundation under a slab or under a building to keep termites from moving up. Or we have soil poisoning as an alternative, or we have treatment. We also, the last one I'll talk about, so we have subterranean termites are economically the most important, but we do have drywood termites in many parts of the country. They're very small in colonies, but they can be locally important. They live in drier wood, as I say, and typically the only way to get rid of them is either to find the wood that's infested and tear it out and replace it, which can be difficult, or to fumigate the entire structure, which is outrageously expensive. So it's hard to keep them out. It's hard to prevent reinfestation, but they're not, fortunately, all that common. We do have ants, and you will sometimes see ants in decaying wood. And this is an example from North America of carpenter ants, but ants are social insects like bees and termites are, but they don't use wood for food, so they're living on other things. And typically, when you see ants in a piece of decayed wood, it's because it's really soft wood that it's easy to tunnel in. They'll go out and find food. They frankly love termites. They find them delicious. But they really don't cause any structural damage to the wood. They're just there because it's a good place to live. So we don't look at them as economically important. This is just an example of carpenter ant damage. And you can see that the ants aren't too affected by preservative. This happens to be creosote treated timber, and they went right through it. I want to just briefly touch on marine wood degradation because it can be locally important in some areas. So all the marine wood borers require some salt water, but that can be quite low. So you can have saltwater intrusion well upstream in an estuary. For example, around Brisbane, we see marine borer attack almost all the way up into up at University of Queensland, where the saltwater does move up periodically, and you do see timber evidence. There are three different groups of marine borers we deal with. The shipworms are very common around the world. There's a couple of different groups. Doritos one here, but they're mollusks. They're like clams. They start off as small, free-swimming larvae. They settle on the wood and they feed. They tunnel in and they expose a siphon on the outside to take water in. They feed at the head and they just digest the wood. They have symbionts that allow them to do that. It's a very small hole that they enter through, and they can get up to, as you see, 19 millimeters in diameter by 300 to 1500 millimeters long. So they can cause a lot of damage in wood fairly quickly. This is an example of a shipworm mouth. You can see the clamshell-like head there and the mouth parts. So they can be incredibly destructive. And in fact, many of the wooden sailing ships that came to Australia had serious shipworm and marine borer problems. The other ones we have here are pholads, which tend to be more tropical. They're clams also, so the mollusks. They start off as small free-swimming larvae, settle in the same way, but they don't penetrate very deeply, and they stay like a clam for their entire life cycle. So they cause a lot of damage on the outside of the wood. Tend to be more common the further north you go in Australia because the water is warmer. They're subtropical and tropical marine borers. And then the final group we have are Limnoria and some Spiroma, and these are free swimming. So they're often look like pill bugs, and they're called gribbles, quaintly. They tunnel in the surface of the wood. You can see that in the middle picture. There's a lot of holes in that wood because the marine borer, the Limnoria have tunneled in. They tunnel in mostly for protection because they don't want to be eaten. And they can cause a lot of damage over time. So what you often see is the marine borers will damage the surface of the wood. The wave action will wear away that wood. It'll expose new wood, and the marine borers are going to say, I don't want to be eaten, so they'll tunnel further in until eventually you see something like this hourglass shape about the tidal zone, and then eventually the wood will fail. All of these organisms are evolved to live in salt water, and they're really important in recycling nutrients in the sea. So they play a real good role unless it's your timber that they're attacking. And they can all be protected by using either naturally durable timbers or using preservative treatments. Mostly though, we have all these other things, but fungal attack or decay is the most important cause of damage in timber globally. And there's estimated like 350,000 different species of fungi. So it doesn't really matter what it is. It's really how you keep it out that matters. We can take a closer look. So all fungi, including molds and decay and all those other things, start off as spores or fragments, and they float in the air, or they move in the water, or they're carried by organisms like insects to a piece of wood that's suitable for growth. They germinate, they grow in, they get nutrients from the material. When they get enough nutrients, they'll produce that fruiting structure that was on the board before, and they'll start the life cycle again. And that process can occur in 24 to 48 hours or 100 years, depending on the organism and the conditions. So there's a lot of variability in what we see. It's important to understand that wherever you are, there are fungi. Even in Antarctica, there are fungi slowly growing on a lot of the timbers, say at the Mawson huts there. So there are, these Petri plates kind of show that they were open to the air for a short period of time. They've got a nutrient media on them, and spores landed and started to grow. And so what you see as the white spots are fungi that were just hanging around in the air. We breathe them in every day. So it's important to understand that if you create conditions that are conducive to fungal growth, something will eventually get there. And that's why design and protection become so important in using timber. As I said, we have different types of fungi. We have molds, we have stain fungi, and we have decay fungi. So this is an example of mold on paint film. Molds don't use the wood as a resource. They grow on sugars or even pollen and things that land on the wood or the paint film itself. They produce spores very quickly that then float through the air and start the cycle again. They can grow on timber, as this lumber pack has lots of mold on it. This one is a bit of an allergen, and that's probably why we worry more about mold. Mold is a sign that the wood has been wet for too long. If you have mold, that's a problem, but it isn't going to weaken the wood structurally. As I said, mold fast growing, doesn't reduce strength. They require wet wood. So if the wood has mold, it's been wet at some point in time. It's more common on sapwood, which is the outer living part of the tree. And some spores can aggravate asthma, and some people are very sensitive to molds, and we have to be very cautious of that for some people, but it's a very small percentage of the population. There's also a blue stain, which can resemble mold, and that's why I have the picture on the left. It's the same picture as before because they're often found together. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side is blue stain that you would see that grows in the sapwood of the timber on the freshly cut tree. On the right-hand side are the spores produced by the stain fungus, and it is closely tied to the life cycle of a bark beetle that gets into freshly killed trees. And those white globs are globs of spores that stick to the beetle as it leaves the tunnel, goes out to a new tree, and those spores then are transported to a new piece of wood to grow on. Stain fungi grow in the wood. They can cause a little bit of damage structurally, but they're mostly a cosmetic defect. They make the wood a little bit more permeable, but they really don't structurally affect it. So you can use stained wood
for lots of applications. So as I said, blue stain fungi or stain fungi attack sapwood, fast growing again. I fear dark colored, which is why the wood is blue, often carried by beetles. They definitely increase the permeability and they can decrease toughness if they go for a long time, but mostly they're cosmetic defects that reduce value. There are other stains on wood. Chemical stains can occur. This is an example of iron stain on a tropical hardwood. It causes the wood to turn black because you get iron tannate, which is black. You often see it on fences where people use non-galvanized fasteners. This is particularly a cedar fence, and you can see that's a black color oozing down from the nails. That's iron stain. Doesn't structurally damage the wood, it just disfigures the color a little bit. And you sometimes see that on freshly constructed decks where the sand or dust lands on it that has iron in it. The wood gets a little wet and that iron reacts with the tannins in the wood to cause the deck to go a little black. So, but structurally not damaged. Bigger problem we have though are decay. Decay fungi structurally damage the wood. They weaken it. They can cause lots of reductions in properties. They attack the cell wall polymers, those three big polymers we have. They can increase permeability, reduce flexural properties, decrease wood mass. So all in all, these are the ones we really should worry about for keeping wood sound. This is an example of decay in a timber. You can see the brown part below is the decayed part, obviously. And we have two different decay types. And they're based visually. So they're chemically very different, but white rot causes the wood to become white and bleached. The wood becomes almost fibrous at times. Brown rot fungi cause the wood to look almost like the wood was burned, except it didn't turn black. It just cracked across the grain. So white rot fungi tend to be more common on hardwoods. Brown rot fungi tend to be more common on softwoods, but like all biology, there's always exceptions. And so we see both types of decay in many cases, depending on the conditions. They both weaken the wood. Brown rot is more important because it weakens the wood more rapidly than white rot does. And so what we want to avoid with brown rot is this happening, where the wood looks perfectly sound on the outside, but it's decayed on the inside. And so that's a hurdle, as we would say. We also have, both of those organisms groups require water for decay to occur. So the wood has to be wet somehow. It has to be above that fiber saturation point. But there's one group of fungi that actually can pull their own water in, and they're called the true dry rot fungi. Luckily, we don't have a lot of them here, or a lot of occurrence of it here, but they are found starting in Europe and then moving around the world. They can actually create like a root that pulls water up into the timber. So this particular piece of wood, the fungus grew up from the ground beneath, or the masonry beneath, into the timber, and you can see the amount of damage it can cause. So luckily, as I say, we don't have them here, but you have to be aware that there are, as I said, always exceptions. This is a fungus that can bring its own water to the party. Okay, we can look at these there's different ways of finding them. Obviously, that's pretty easy to find, but sometimes we want to look earlier in the decay process. And so what we can look in the laboratory, and we can either look under a microscope to identify the fungi or see whether they're decaying or not, or we can culture them. So on the left is a microscope, is a slide of a piece of softwood, and it's been stained with a special dye. And you can see the yellow is the wood cell wall. That's the tracheids that move water up and down. The green stuff going across is the fungus. That piece of wood had about 80% loss in bending strength. So for a little bit of fungus growing through, you can get a lot of damage. On the right-hand side is where we've taken a bit of the wood and put it on a plate with some nutrient agar on it, and we can let the fungus grow out, and that white fluffy thing is a decay fungus. So those are typically ways we can look at the wood. We're getting more sophisticated now. We can actually take bits of the wood, isolate the DNA, and sequence it. But in most cases, you don't really need to do that. You can look at the wood and figure things out. We also have a third group of decay types, which are soft rot. So soft rot fungi grow on the surface of the wood. They grow inward. If you looked at a piece of soundwood, this is a piece of pine, and you can see the cell walls are the hard parts. The openings are the lumens where the water would go. This is what soft rot fungi do to the wood. They tend to be found on the outside of the timber. They tend to be fairly slow acting, so they take a long time to grow. But eventually we see that they'll fail the outside of the wood, which in the case of something like this utility pole is where most of the bending strength is. So they can cause a lot of damage. And if you look around the country, you'll see lots of areas where the poles have surface decay on them, and right at ground line, you'll see that the circumference is much reduced. So we want to avoid that. It is always been a problem with hardwood poles particularly. Fortunately, most decay tends to be slow unless you get to far North Queensland where the conditions are ideal. So we have time to capture it, catch it, and detect it and control it, either by drying the wood or by replacing or treating the wood. So there's lots of things that affect that. Wood species is the major one. We have heaps of species that are very resistant to decay and insect attack. That's only in the heartwood. So we have heartwood and sapwood. So if you have a lot of sapwood, that wood is more susceptible to decay. The moisture content matters depending on the fungus. Dimensions matter because a big piece of timber will tend, once it gets wet, to stay wet longer than a small piece of timber that will dry out fairly quickly. And then we have supplemental treatments. I'll go really quickly through this. One of the ways to figure out if you have moisture issues in a building is just a moisture meter. You can buy these at Bunnings or other shops, and they can tell you whether the wood is wet. They don't tell you whether it's decaying. They just tell you whether conditions are ripe for doing that. And you can either use a surface moisture meter or a pin moisture meter, which goes in a little more deeply. Both of them can give you some idea about what's going on. A hammer is pretty good, and so is a drill, but you really don't want to destroy the wood. But you can look at the shavings or get a feeling from the sound of the wood to see whether it's has any issues going on. There are smaller drills. This is a resistograph, which is used for looking at trees and some timbers. It has a very small drill bit, so you can detect voids inside the timber. People are also using acoustics, so that's sound waves going across the wood. They're changed by the presence of decay. We can detect voids in the wood. This is on a very valuable shade tree, but we use them on things like utility poles as well. And there's a lot of work going on in structures looking at infrared imaging, because you're not going to detect decay, but you can look at places where the wood is wet. So wherever the moisture tends to collect, that wood will change temperature more slowly than the wood on other parts of it. And you can look at the windows there and see at the bottom right-hand corner of two of those windows, the temperature is higher, and therefore you've got moisture there. You may not have decay, but it tells you that's an area where you should be looking. When we look at protecting timber, and this is for structures, but it fits in for all things, we look at 4 Ds, and deflection, drainage, drying, and durability. And so each of these is put into a design of a timber, and we try and use one or more of these to protect it. So prevention, obviously soil contact is important, water shedding elements, coatings all come into play for preventing damage. We can isolate the timber, so there's no direct path from the ground to the timber, either using chemicals or physical barriers. These are just examples of barriers. So what we're doing here is trying to get in separation. So then we'll look at a little more carefully. And the other one is to avoid wetting. So these are all examples of features that keep the wood from direct contact with the soil or concrete, because otherwise water will be absorbed. And this is a bad example of how not to do that, because this is right on the metal plate, which is allowing water to move and wick up into the timber. These are also problems. The one on the right is actually quite good. It's got about a 25 millimeter separation between the ground and the plate. And the plate is doing all the work, so it doesn't really have to be right on the ground for that post to support the column. And then sometimes you'll see things like this. This is a bad example, but this is where wood has checked a little bit. And you'd want to be a little careful about that. But there's separation between the wood and the ground, which is really important. Coatings can help. Obviously, clear coatings, most people want to see the wood, so clear coatings work, but they don't last as long. Water repellents can help, but realize they must be maintained. So a water repellent treatment, people will claim 3 or more years. 2 to 3 years is probably the most you'll get out of most water repellent coatings, because the UV damage will just destroy the coating. And so they do need to be reapplied, so you need to be aware of that, but they do work. And then the other thing we can look at is natural durability. So we'll talk, I think next week you'll hear a little bit more about this, but the heartwood of many species, which is the dead part of the standing tree, can have chemicals in it that are incredibly effective against decay and insect attack. It's important to understand natural durability is heartwood only. So if you have any sapwood, that doesn't work. It varies widely between and within trees. It varies from old to second growth. And realistically, it's chemical protection, whether you want to delude yourself that it's not chemistry going on here. These are preservatives. There's natural ones. In Australia, we have 4 categories for durability. We go from highly durable to non-durable, from class 1 to 4. We have a classification of about 280 species and standard AS 5604 that can tell you what species to use in different applications. They give you life expectancy. So a lot of information here that you can use. We also know that these durability categories are for heartwood. So if sapwood is present, you need to treat the wood. So sapwood present on any of these species, durability class 1 to 4, they all have to be treated. If you have durability classes 3 and 4, which are lower durability, the heartwood has to be treated too within certain limits. So we live with natural durability in some cases. In other cases, we have to supplement that protection. Preservative treatments have been around for over 190, 100, 200, almost 200 years. And they were developed originally for the British Navy, and then they moved outward from there. They mostly protect the sapwood, so we try to protect the shell treatment. And a good treatment should last 30 to 80 years. And there are examples of pieces of treated timber that are well over those ages if they're done properly and maintained. And the goal is to protect a shell of wood that's sufficient to support the load. So it doesn't have to be all the wood, but it has to be enough of the wood to support what's there. And there's lots of different ways of getting chemical in the wood, and it really depends on the end use. So dipping and envelope treatments are very shallow. We add treatments to the glue line and some of the composites that we use. Otherwise, we use vacuums and pressure combinations to force chemical in the wood. This is just surface treatment, totally unsafe because there's no safety gloves, but it does coat the surface. It'll give you a little bit of protection, and we recommend that wherever you cut timber for fabrication. We have standards in Australia go from hazard classes basis from 1 to 6, and they'll be talked about a lot more next week. Obviously, 1 is the lowest hazard, which is powder post beetles interior, all the way up to saltwater and H6. And so we need to be aware of where our timber is going to be exposed. This is just a dip treatment. This is actually for sap stain control. This is flood coating, which you'll often see in green framing that's used for termite protection inside structures for trusses and frames. Very important and a very big part of preservative protection. This is a pressure treating cylinder. You would see it under cover now, but this is an old picture. It's just a big tube. You can put vacuum and pressure on it to force the chemical into the wood more deeply than you would if you just dipped it. And then all of that wood needs to have a tag on it. You'll hear more about this next week that tells you who treated it, what chemical it's treated with, and what hazard class it's treated to, so that the user or the fabricator can know what they're working with. And this is just, you can see we're putting the Australian standard 1604. Choosing the proper treated wood, you really want to know what your hazard is and ensure that it's properly treated. That's why the end tags are so important. You want to minimize cuts or holes, and where you do have to do that, you want to make sure you treat those surfaces that have been exposed. It's really important to maintain the structure, particularly because treated wood will perform biologically really well, but the UV damage may become severe, and so you want to look at coatings as a part of the treatment system. There's lots of other things coming along. So those are preservative treatments, chemical biocides. There are lots of modified woods that are coming along. We see a lot of treatment with anhydrides. Acetylation is one of the big ones that's coming into Australia. It's been used in Europe. It's been around for probably 35 years. It's not new. It's actually developed back in the 20s. But we put a chemical in that changes the water behavior of the wood, and it makes the wood less reactive to, or less susceptible to decay. That is, you're seeing a lot of that in Australia. It has performed well, particularly above ground, but we also have some work in marine environments where it's done well as well. There are thermal treatments, which are also coming in. You heat the wood at high temperature, you change its moisture behavior. It changes the wood chemistry. It alters that moisture relationship so that the wood doesn't wet as quickly. It is particularly useful for things like cladding, where the wood can dry out. It has no termite resistance. It's important to understand that you need to supplement the thermal modification with some type of a termiticide or a barrier that keeps the termites away. But we are seeing them come. They're widely used in Europe and becoming important in North America as well. Performance is going to depend. And so it depends on where you are. If I'm in far north Queensland and I put a piece of timber in and I put the same piece of timber down in Tasmania, Tasmania is going to last a lot longer. That's pretty obvious. The conditions are suitable. The moisture is there. The temperature is right for far north Queensland. Material characteristics, the treatment, the species. Design and detailing make a big difference. So if somebody designs properly to shed water, that timber is going to last a lot longer.
If they have good training, and that becomes why training for carpenters is so important, to make sure they understand the material better so they work with it, because typically if somebody makes a mistake in, say, a complex of buildings they're building, they don't just make it once, they make it hundreds of times. And that mistake can lead to lots of problems. And then the other part is to make sure that things are properly maintained. I want to touch on wood plastic composites because they're coming into the marketplace. These are wood, usually 60% wood, 40% plastic, or 40-60, they depend on the ratios. They are incredibly cool because you can bend them and do things with them. And this is an example of Trex, which is one of the products. It's important to understand that they have wood in them. So some of the older versions, this is an example of Trex in Hawaii, and that beautiful orange thing is a fungus, is that they can decay if they're not properly treated. Most of the newer materials now have biocides in them and coatings to make them last longer, so they're less susceptible to decay. But they do have, everything has its advantages and disadvantages. This is just one you have to be aware of. But they are interesting products, and they are a wood product, really. I want to finish off on flooding. This is the Brisbane flood from 2022. That's actually looking out my window. That's my car park. Flooding is important because we'll periodically see we live in a country of extremes, and we need to understand that moisture is always going to be coming in suddenly. And so flooding effects are obviously, the wood is going to swell. It's going to be weaker while it's wet, but it's going to dry. The fasteners may need to be looked at. It's the biggest issue you run in with flooding is that it's going to support rapid mold growth. So the fungi will grow very quickly particularly on gypsum board, because it's got all that paper to grow on. Eventually, if you let it sit long enough, it'll support fungal decay. If you let it sit long enough, it'll damage to the fasteners. It may increase the termite risk, and we are seeing more termite attack in Brisbane since we had the flood. But it doesn't really affect the wood strength once the wood is dry. So you have to remember that it's repairable. You see on the far upper right, you see mold on the drywall. That's a problem, but that you take that out, and that timber behind it just needs to be dried. You want to look at fasteners and things, but one of the beauties of wood is in a living tree, it's wet. When you dry it out, it's stable and the way we want to use it. But when it gets wet again, it can dry out again. As long as you don't let it stay wet too long, it's going to be perfectly sound. So timber is not a bad thing to have in a flood zone, as long as you get rid of the mold and stuff around it and you repair it quickly. So with that, I'd like to stop, and there's time for a few questions. I apologize, I went over a little bit. But the other thing to remember is, so we're based at the University of the Sunshine Coast. My email address is here. We're always happy to answer questions about what's happening. And if you have interesting problems, those are really cool to look at too. And you've got my email address. Feel free to contact us. As I say, I'm from the state. I'm here to help you. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thanks for that, Jeff. That was amazing. Some terrific information there. So I do encourage some more questions. As landscape architects, you're dealing with wood out in the elements all the time. So yeah, I'm sure you've got lots of questions there to ask. We've got a couple of questions here. Oops, sorry about that. I'll just that we'll start off with. We had a question here, Jeff, about how would the end user know whether they're looking at sapwood or heartwood?
Typically, sapwood is white and the heartwood is darker colored. And this would only be on the hardwoods. The pine, well, the pine you'd have to treat anyway if you're going to put it outside, but you should see it as a color difference. There are indicators that you can use as well, but color is a good indicator.
Yep. And this is a good question from Kim. What would be the percentage level on a moisture meter when you would say the number is becoming concerning?
So moisture meters have a range of accuracy, and once you go above 20%, they tend to lose accuracy. If I saw moisture meters pegging at like 24 to 30%, I'd be really worried. Below that, I probably wouldn't.
Yeah, I think we normally say, Jeff, don't we? Sort of 12 to 18% is sort of seasoned timber, which sort of is, not a problem. It's when you're getting moisture above 20 or 22%, that's when you're going to get mold growth, fungi problems.
Yeah. So, I mean, just, obviously if you start the higher you go, once you go above 24 to 30, the accuracy of the meter is not that good anyway. So.
I had a question here at the start from Nelson. Can you suggest any recommendations for the international weathering of timber in the harsh climate of Australia? I've observed this technique being utilised in colder climates abroad. Would like to know if it can be applied locally using a durable wood like jarrah.
You mean, sorry, intentional wood? So help me.
Intentional recommendations, yes, for the intentional weathering of timber.
So, the weathering is a slow process. It takes centuries to really get a deep. I mean, we have posts, actually our DAF partners have samples out in their test site that are treated radiata pine, CCA treated. And there's a lot of weathering on that wood because it's very soft, and particularly in the early wood, the open lighter parts of the rings. But those woods are 30 years old. They're coming up on their 35. It's a slow process. So allowing the wood to weather is fine as long as you like the color. And so it's really very much an aesthetic of what the architect or the designer feels they want to see. I can give you an example of a building in Oregon where the wood is blotchy and moldy because they didn't pay attention to that. And you just want to be aware of the colors you're going to see there. But you're right. If you allow it to weather naturally, it can look quite attractive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And often that's the case with the client and the architect, that they want the wood to grey off to match in, as we've seen often with sort of surf lifesaving clubs and things where you're down in the dunes. But we do need to be careful, don't we, Jeff? You often see buildings where, the north face will weather differently to the south face, and the north will be quite grey and the south could actually have moulds and things growing on it. So you do need to be quite aware with the building.
Yeah, it's particularly when you've got shaded areas and non-shaded areas, and even under windows, you get a lot of variation, which is obviously not attractive. So that's something to concern. Then, in some cases, we're talking about barns. I mean, people preferentially buy wood from old barns because it's so attractive in color. It's it's lightened or it's darkened, and they like that patina on the wood.
I had a question here about acetylated wood. What are the other brands of acetylated wood around? We've only been able to find one out here.
There's only one. So Akoya is the only product you'll find on the market. There is the other product, which is not acetylated. It's treated with a polymer or monomer, is Kebony. You'll see on the market. I haven't seen it that much, but it is here. They're effective, and we'll probably see more of them coming in. Obviously, if you look at cost, it's a cost factor that they are more expensive and they're not for everything, but they do perform well.
Yep. A question here about for unseasoned products, how do you best control shrinkage and cracking rate of timber after installation?
You don't. It's hard to deal with timber because if you dry it too quickly, you're going to obviously put a lot more stress on it and get cracks and checks. It's hard otherwise to do that because it's just a natural phenomenon of the wood shrinking in different directions at different rates. So you're pretty much constrained by that. There are ways to kerf it and do some things with it, but that's probably not what you'd want to do in a building.
Yeah, look, having been around the industry a long time now, I can remember back when everything was unseasoned, there wasn't a lot that was actually seasoned. So we used to build all our houses out of unseasoned timber. Certainly back then, we understood the shrinkage in the different directions, as Jeff mentioned before, of different timber species. And that information is available if you want to know for species what the shrinkage rates are. So we always used to do design for that. So allow sort of bigger gaps under windows, knowing that the frames would shrink. These days, most of the product we have is seasoned, so we're less sort of issues about shrinkage and cracking anymore. But certainly that information's about if people want it.
Yeah, in fact, the WoodSolutions, there's tables in the WoodSolutions guides to do that.
That's correct. Yep. Question here from Juliana: is it possible to remove completely mold from timber, preventing health problems in a building?
Yes. So mold is a water issue, really. And so in a lot of cases, and you want to get, if it's a small amount of mold, I would just take a little bit of soapy water and wipe it off and it would go away. If the wood stays dry, the fungus isn't going to grow back out and it's probably dead by then. If there's a lot of mold in a building, you definitely want to get a professional in who can handle the spore load and do things properly. But yes, if you clean the surface of the wood and keep it dry, the mold isn't going to come back. So it's repairable.
Edmund asks, does the design engineer need to specify the use of heartwood if required, and then do the timber yard separate the sapwood from the heartwood? As an engineer, what information should he be putting on his drawings?
Good question. I don't honestly know if I've been in timber yards and I've never seen him separate the heartwood from the sapwood. I suppose you
Yeah,
can
no.
buy all hard, but I don't know that you'd see that in a timber yard easily.
Yeah, no, they don't really. I mean, sometimes they'll take the sapwood out if that's a problem, but generally, as you mentioned before, Jeff, you work on the natural durability for the heartwood, and then anything that sapwood gets treated. So somewhere between the preservation treatment and the natural durability, the wood's protected.
And if you look at the species, you can look in the slides later, the list, you've got species like spotted gum, blackbud, merbau, that are naturally durable. And you tend to see mostly heartwood on those anyway, in terms of the marketplace.
All right, well, that's fantastic. That's been some great questions there. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for your presentation. I just remind everyone that these webinars are recorded. We had that as a question, can people see this afterwards? So it'll be uploaded to the WoodSolutions website over the next week or so. So you can definitely come back and get this information again, or let your colleagues know about the great presentation that Jeff's provided. I also remind you about our technical design guide number 5, and I really would encourage you to download this. If you go through it for different conditions, it actually allows you to work through tables anywhere in Australia and determine the sort of durability of design life for both the natural heartwood and also for different treated products. So it's a great document and certainly worth having as part of your library. So we have 2 more of our webinars left. So if you haven't registered, please do so for the next 2 weeks. The one next week is almost like the sister to this one, because durability is such an important topic, but also because a lot of our wood these days is sapwood and has no natural durability, we do have to preservatively treat it. So next week, we'll talk about both of these topics, timber preservation with Jack Norton, and also external finishes. So how we keep our timber looking good, if that's what we want to do, and not weather, from Gareth Connell from Cabot. So certainly encourage you to join us again next week. So thanks all once again, and look forward to seeing you again. Have a terrific day.